Imagine standing at the edge of a map, not as a metaphor, but literally. You're looking at the finest chart European cartographers could produce in the early 16th century, and somewhere near the bottom, the coastlines just stop. The ink runs out. Beyond that last careful line, there's nothing. Not ocean, not land, just the terrifying blankness of the unknown. Now imagine sailing into it anyway. In September 1519, a Portuguese navigator named Ferdinand Magellan led 5 ships out of the Spanish port of Sanlúcar de Barramundi and pointed them toward waters that existing maps could barely explain. His stated mission was to find a westward route to the Spice Islands, the Maluku Islands of modern Indonesia, a passage that most experts of the day believed either didn't exist or was simply too far, too dangerous, and too uncertain to attempt. He was sailing, in every meaningful sense, beyond the last line on the map. What followed over the next 3 years was one of the most extraordinary journeys in human history, and also one of the most brutal. Magellan's expedition was not a triumphant adventure story moving cleanly from departure to discovery to return. It was something far more complicated. 5 ships left Spain. Only one came home. Of the roughly 270 men who began the voyage, fewer than 20 completed it. Along the way, the expedition survived violent mutinies, catastrophic starvation, uncharted seas that seemed to have no end, and the near-total collapse of leadership at the moments it was needed most. And here's what makes the story even harder to contain in a simple narrative. Magellan himself never made it back. He died on a small island in the Philippines, killed in a battle he arguably shouldn't have fought less than halfway through the full circumnavigation. So in a technically precise sense, Magellan did not sail around the world. He sailed into a story that someone else finished. That complication, the gap between the man who drove the expedition and the man who brought it home, sits at the heart of everything this voyage represents. Who deserves the credit? What exactly was proven? And what does it mean that the first circumnavigation of the Earth was achieved through improvisation, desperation, and sheer refusal to surrender, rather than through any single leader's unbroken vision? These are the questions worth sitting with, because the answers reveal something much larger than a single explorer's legacy. The Magellan-Elcano expedition, and it is worth noting both names right from the start, didn't just complete a navigational milestone. It fundamentally restructured how Europeans understood the planet they lived on. It proved the Pacific Ocean existed and measured its staggering scale. It confirmed that the Earth was a single, continuous, navigable body of water. And it demonstrated, through a strange quirk of timekeeping that confused everyone aboard the returning ship, that the world itself could deceive you about something as basic as what day it was. But before any of that, there's a man to understand, a navigator with a complicated past, a near-obsessive focus on a passage no one else believed in, and the extraordinary, reckless confidence to walk into a Spanish king's court and propose the impossible. This is the story of how the world got bigger, and the price it cost to prove it. To understand why Magellan's plan seemed simultaneously brilliant and insane, you have to understand what Europeans actually knew about the world in 1519, and more importantly, what they thought they knew. 27 years had passed since Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean. Vasco da Gama had rounded the southern tip of Africa and reached India by 1498. The contours of the Atlantic coastlines of the Americas were being sketched in, roughly but recognizably, by a generation of Portuguese and Spanish pilots who had spent their careers probing new shorelines. By the standards of a century earlier, Europeans were swimming in geographical information. Charts were being updated constantly. New place names were multiplying, and the printing press was circulating maps to audiences who had never had access to them before. And yet the maps of 1519 were, in critical ways, a patchwork of certainty and fantasy stitched together so seamlessly that it was almost impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Take the Waldseemüller map of 1507. the document that first named the landmass in the western Atlantic America after Amerigo Vespucci. It showed the new continent with impressive detail along its eastern coast, but on its western side the map simply left a gap. Not a coastline, not a defined ocean, just open space. Some cartographers of the period showed a narrow body of water between the Americas and Asia, largely because that was what made geographical sense to them, not because anyone had seen it. Others borrowed from Ptolemy, the ancient Greek geographer, whose ideas about the shape of the inhabited world had survived into the Renaissance largely intact, even where they were demonstrably wrong. Classical authority and brand new observation sat side by side in the same document, and no one had a reliable method for distinguishing between them. The result was a kind of cartographic wishful thinking. Mapmakers drew coastlines that hardened rumours into solid lines. They placed islands in rough positions based on sailors' estimates of latitude and distance, estimates that could be off by hundreds of miles. They left sea monsters in the margins not necessarily because they believed in them, but because something had to fill the space, and blankness itself was unsettling to a paying audience. And crucially, they had almost no reliable way to measure longitude, which meant that, while you might know roughly how far north or south you were, how far east or west remained educated guesswork. This wasn't ignorance so much as it was the inevitable shape of knowledge at the frontier. The people making these maps were genuinely brilliant. They were synthesizing everything that was known into the most coherent picture they could construct. But the synthesized picture was, at key points, deeply wrong, and no one yet knew which parts. Into this half-illuminated world came the question that was driving the most powerful empires in Europe to spectacular lengths of effort and expense. Where are the Spice Islands, and how do you get there? The answer mattered in a way that is difficult to overstate. Spices, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, pepper, were among the most valuable commodities on earth. They preserved food, masked the taste of spoilage, served as medicine, and functioned as a form of currency in their own right. A ship that came back from the Moluccas loaded with cloves could generate returns that made the cost of the voyage look laughable. The trade was not a luxury, it was the engine of considerable portions of the European economy, and whoever controlled the route controlled an extraordinary flow of wealth. Portugal had found its answer by going east. Da Gama's route around Africa opened a direct maritime path to the Indian Ocean that Portuguese ships had been exploiting aggressively ever since. By 1511, Portugal had seized Malacca on the Malay Peninsula, a critical hub, and was pushing further into the archipelago that held the spice-producing islands. The Portuguese route was long, dangerous, and required maintaining a chain of fortified trading posts across thousands of miles of ocean, but it worked. Portugal was making extraordinary sums of money. Spain was watching this with a mixture of admiration and fury, and the political dimension was sharpened by the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494 under papal arbitration. That agreement had divided the unexplored world between the two Iberian powers along a line drawn through the Atlantic, giving Spain everything to the west and Portugal everything to the east. In principle, this meant Spain could lay claim to the Americas. In practice, it created an unresolved and enormously consequential question. Where did that dividing line fall on the other side of the globe? If the Spice Islands lay on Spain's side of the anti-meridian, Spain had a legitimate claim to them, and a legitimate basis for establishing its own spice trade. But to assert that claim, Spain needed to reach the islands by sailing west. Nobody had done it. The westward route faced a seemingly insuperable geographical obstacle. There was a continent in the way. The entire connected land mass of the Americas stretched from near the Arctic to the southern latitudes, and as far as anyone could confirm in 515-19, it had no gap, no passage, no opening large enough to sail a ship through. Explorers had probed the eastern coast of South America, looking for a way through the Rio de la Plata, which opens into a vast estuary, had fooled more than one navigator into thinking it might be an oceanic passage before it revealed itself as a river. The coast seemed to go on forever, an unbroken wall between the Atlantic and whatever lay beyond. But there were reasons to think a passage might exist. Some maps showed a strait, though they disagreed violently about where it was. Sailors who had ventured far south along the South American coast reported that the land seemed to be curving, narrowing, potentially ending. And Magellan, for reasons that combined genuine research, personal intelligence networks, and what appears to have been an almost visceral conviction, believed the passage was real and that he knew roughly where to find it. What he based that conviction on, which maps he had seen, which Portuguese pilots he had spoken with, what was contained in the correspondence and intelligence he had gathered, remains one of the intriguing open questions of the story, because he guarded that knowledge carefully. What made the whole enterprise peculiarly charged, beyond the navigational uncertainty, was the political tension between Spain and Portugal that sat just beneath the surface of the entire enterprise. Magellan was Portuguese. He was proposing to lead a Spanish expedition to challenge Portuguese dominance of the spice trade. The Portuguese crown had already declined his services, apparently dismissing his proposal with some contempt. Now he was going to take his plan to their rivals. This wasn't just a navigational disagreement. It was something closer to treason in the eyes of Lisbon, and the Portuguese would spend years actively trying to undermine, intercept, and destroy the expedition he was about to launch. The rivalry between the two crowns meant that Magellan sailed not just into geographical uncertainty, but into a situation where a hostile foreign power had strong incentives to ensure he failed. And so, by the time Magellan began assembling his proposal for the Spanish court, the expedition existed at the intersection of several enormous forces: the economic desperation of a major empire to break a competitor's monopoly, the genuine geographical mystery of whether any westward passage existed, the sketchy and unreliable nature of the maps that would guide them, and the personal ambition of a navigator who had been rejected at home and was betting everything on an idea that the majority of informed opinion considered either impossible or not worth the cost. Whether the expedition was plausible or insane depended entirely on which parts of the uncertainty you chose to weight most heavily. There were reasons to believe a passage existed. There were reasons to believe it could be navigated. There was a rough economic logic to the whole thing that gave it a veneer of sound calculation. But there was also the small matter that the route had never been sailed, that no one knew how wide the ocean on the other side might be, that the maps were guesswork in all the most important places, and that the whole project rested on the judgment of one man who was keeping his most important intelligence to himself. That man was about to walk into the Spanish court and try to sell all of this, the uncertainty, the risk, the promise, and the possibility, to a young king who desperately needed to believe in it. Before that, though, you need to understand where Magellan himself came from, because the relentlessness that drove the entire expedition didn't emerge from nowhere. It was made by years of experience in a far harsher school than any royal court, by campaigns in Africa and India and Southeast Asia, by battles and shipwrecks and setbacks that would have ended most men's ambitions entirely. The voyage he proposed in 1519 was, in a very real sense, the sum of everything he had already survived. Ferdinand de Magallan, the man the Spanish would come to call Fernando de Magallans, and whom history would anglicise into Magellan, was born somewhere in northern Portugal around 1480, into a family of minor nobility. The exact details of his origins are hazy in the way that so much of his early life is hazy. The records are thin, the accounts sometimes contradictory, and Magellan himself seems to have been constitutionally uninterested in self-promotion. What we can piece together is a portrait of someone who learned the world not in classrooms or through inherited wealth, but through decades of hard service in places that were, by any measure, extraordinarily dangerous. As a young man, Magellan entered the Portuguese royal court as a page, a position that gave him access to education, to the mechanics of governance, and critically, to the swirling information networks of a maritime empire that was, at that precise moment in history, aggressively reshaping global trade. This was Lisbon at the height of its ambition, In the years after da Gama's return from India, when Portuguese ships were pushing deeper into the Indian Ocean, and the wealth flowing back to the capital was transforming the city. For an intelligent, observant young man with military inclinations, it was a remarkable place to come of age. In 1505, Magellan shipped out. He was part of the great fleet commanded by Francisco de Almeida, Portugal's first viceroy of India, and the voyage took him into a world that very few Europeans had yet seen. The Indian Ocean in the early 16th century was not empty maritime space waiting to be discovered. It was one of the most intensely trafficked commercial environments on Earth, a network of monsoon-driven trade routes connecting East Africa, Arabia, Persia, India, and Southeast Asia that had been functioning for centuries before the Portuguese arrived. Arab, Indian, Malay, Swahili, and Chinese merchants had built a sophisticated interlocking system of commerce, and the Portuguese entered it not as polite participants, but as aggressive, often violent interlopers who wanted to dominate it by force. Magellan fought in that world for years. He was at the Battle of Cananor in 1506, one of several engagements in which Portuguese naval forces clashed with Arab fleets for control of the Indian Ocean trade. He survived a shipwreck off the East African coast. He participated in the brutal Portuguese campaigns to establish and defend their network of trading posts and fortifications, what the Portuguese called the Estado da India, the State of India, which was really an empire held together by cannon and audacity spread across thousands of miles of coastline. This was not the clean, distant violence of a courtly career. It was close, dirty, and formative in ways that a comfortable life could never be. By 1509, he was part of Diogo Lopes de Sequeira's reconnaissance expedition to Malacca, the great trading port at the tip of the Malay Peninsula that sat at the crossroads of Indian Ocean and Southeast Asian commerce. This was the gateway to the spice trade, the place where the nutmeg and cloves of the Moluccas arrived before being distributed westward. Magellan almost died there. The expedition ran into a carefully planned local ambush, and accounts suggest that Magellan's quick action helped warn and rescue Portuguese sailors who would otherwise have been killed or captured. He escaped, but the experience left him with something invaluable, a direct personal understanding of the geography, the politics, and the commercial stakes of the world the Portuguese were fighting over. He had been within reach of the Spice Islands. He had seen the eastern end of the trade network that was generating such extraordinary wealth. He understood in a way that few men in Europe did what the prize actually looked like up close. In 1511, he was part of the campaign that mattered most for his future ambitions, the Portuguese conquest of Malacca under Afonso de Albuquerque, one of the most ruthless and effective commanders of the age. The fall of Malacca gave Portugal control of the critical choke point of Southeast Asian trade, and it brought Magellan even closer to the Moluccas. There is reason to believe that following the conquest, he may have sailed on one of the Portuguese expeditions that probed further east toward the spice-producing islands of the Banda Sea. The evidence is not conclusive, but the possibility is significant, because if Magellan had direct knowledge of those islands' locations, even approximate knowledge, it would explain the particular confidence he projected when he later argued that he knew where to find them from the other direction. What's beyond dispute is that by the time Magellan returned to Portugal, probably around 1512 or 1513, he had accumulated a decade of experience that was, in navigational and strategic terms, extraordinary. He had fought in multiple major engagements. He had survived a shipwreck. He had seen the Indian Ocean world from multiple angles, as a soldier, as a sailor, as a political observer. He had developed an understanding of the spice trade that went beyond the purely theoretical, and he had spent years thinking about geography in a very practical sense, not as lines on a map, but as real coastlines with real hazards, real currents, and real strategic implications. That experience also came with a developing set of ambitions that didn't fit neatly within the structures available to him in Portugal. Magellan served in Morocco in 1513 during the campaigns along the North African coast, And it was there that things began to go wrong in ways that would ultimately push him toward Spain. He was wounded in combat, left with a permanent limp, and then found himself entangled in an accusation, apparently involving charges that he had traded illegally with Moorish enemies of Portugal. The charges may have been exaggerated or even fabricated by rivals, as was common enough in the intensely competitive environment of Portuguese military service. What mattered was the consequence. His reputation with the crown was damaged, his requests for advancement were ignored, and when he petitioned King Manuel I of Portugal for an increase in his pension, a small routine request based on his years of service, the king reportedly dismissed him with particular coldness. The exact nature of Manuel's rebuff is described with varying dramatic flourish depending on the source, but the core of it seems consistent. The king was not interested in what Magellan had to offer. Whether this reflected genuine suspicion of his conduct, jealousy from rivals at court who had undermined him, or simple indifference to a minor noble whose usefulness appeared to have run its course, the result was the same. Magellan had given more than a decade of dangerous service to the Portuguese crown, and had come home to find that service effectively devalued. Around 1514 or 1515, Magellan began to pivot. He started investigating seriously whether a western passage to the Spice Islands might exist, working through maps, corresponding with other navigators and cosmographers, building a theoretical case. He apparently made contact with Rui Falero, a Portuguese astronomer and cosmographer with a reputation for brilliant but erratic thinking, who had his own theories about longitude and navigation and shared Magellan's growing conviction that the westward route was not only possible but plausible. Together, they would eventually form the partnership that carried the proposal to Spain. But here the personal and the strategic converged in a way that is worth pausing on. Magellan was not simply a jilted servant looking for revenge on the Portuguese crown. His grievance was real, but it existed alongside, and arguably sharpened, a genuine strategic vision. He had spent years in the Indian Ocean world. He understood that Portugal's dominance of the spice trade rested on one route, and that route was vulnerable to the political and economic reality, that it required Portugal to maintain an empire of fortified trading posts across thousands of miles of hostile territory. A western route, if it existed and could be navigated, wouldn't just embarrass Portugal, it would potentially break open the entire structure of the trade, establishing Spain as a rival power in a market that Portugal had treated as its exclusive property. The combination of personal injury and strategic calculation made Magellan a particular kind of dangerous, someone who had both the knowledge to make the case credibly and the motivation to push it past every obstacle. He formally renounced his Portuguese citizenship, relocated to Seville, and married into a Spanish family. These were not the tentative moves of a man hedging his bets. They were the deliberate choices of someone who had decided that if Portugal wouldn't use what he knew, then Spain would be given the chance. And what he was about to walk into the Spanish court and propose was, by any measure, audacious to the point of absurdity. A westward voyage to the Spice Islands through a passage that had never been confirmed to exist, across an ocean whose size no European had ever measured, based on a combination of hard-won experience, secret intelligence, theoretical reasoning, and what might generously be called informed conviction. Whether the Spanish court would buy it was the next question entirely. In the winter of 1517, Magellan and Falero walked into one of the most consequential sales pitches in the history of exploration. Their audience was the Spanish court at Valladolid, and more specifically, a 17-year-old king who had only recently arrived from the Netherlands to claim his inheritance, and was still learning the geography of his own kingdoms, let alone the broader world. King Charles I of Spain, who would later become Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, one of the most powerful rulers in European history, was young, foreign-born, politically uncertain, and surrounded by Castilian nobles who were not entirely sure what to make of him. He was also critically hungry for legitimacy, for revenue, for the kind of prestige that would cement his authority not just in Spain, but across the European political landscape where he was already a significant, if untested, player. when two Portuguese navigators arrived at his court carrying charts, arguments, and the promise of a new route to the most valuable commodities on earth. They were offering something that aligned perfectly with what the young king needed most. The proposal itself was striking in its combination of precision and audacity. Magellan and Falero argued that the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, source of the cloves, nutmeg, and mace, that commanded extraordinary prices across European markets, lay within the Spanish hemisphere, as defined by the Treaty of Tordesillas. This was the 1494 agreement that had attempted to divide the non-Christian world between Spain and Portugal along a line drawn through the Atlantic Ocean. Spain got the western half, Portugal got the eastern. At the time, the treaty had seemed to favour Portugal heavily, since everyone understood that the known sea route to Asia ran east around Africa. But Magellan and Falero were now arguing that if you extended that dividing line all the way around the globe, something the original negotiators hadn't thought through carefully, because the idea of actually sailing around the globe had been essentially theoretical, then the Moluccas fell on the Spanish side of the line. Whether this was actually true was, and remains, genuinely debatable. The calculation depended on where exactly you placed the Tordesillas meridian on the other side of the world, and the measurement of longitude in the early 16th century was imprecise enough that honest experts could reach very different conclusions. Magellan and Falero almost certainly knew this. What they were offering wasn't so much an airtight legal argument as a credible enough geographical claim to give Spain political cover for challenging Portugal's monopoly on the spice trade, for a young king looking for leverage that was worth a great deal. What made the proposal serious, rather than merely clever, was Magellan's experiential authority. He had been to the Indian Ocean. He had been to Malacca. He had seen the eastern architecture of the spice trade from the inside. When he stood before Charles and his advisers and spoke about the geography of Southeast Asia, he wasn't speculating in the way that armchair cosmographers sometimes did. He was drawing on a decade of direct, often violent engagement with that part of the world. He reportedly brought charts, including at least one that Falero had helped him develop using a globe to illustrate the westward route, and he demonstrated with confidence that there was a passage through or around the South American landmass that would take Spanish ships into the Pacific. The passage, he insisted, existed. He claimed to know its approximate location based on a combination of his own knowledge, maps he had seen in Portuguese archives, and information shared by other navigators. That last claim raises questions historians have never fully resolved. How much did Magellan actually know? And how much was he committing to in the heat of advocacy? There are suggestions that he had seen Portuguese charts showing a possible passage at the southern end of South America, charts that Portugal considered state secrets, and that Magellan may have had legitimate access to during his years of service. Whether his confidence about the Strait's existence was based on solid intelligence, or on an educated extrapolation from incomplete evidence, is something we can't say with certainty. What we can say is that his confidence was persuasive. The terms that emerged from the negotiations were generous. Magellan and Falero were promised the governorship of any lands they discovered, a share of the profits from the voyage, reportedly 1/20th of the net gains, and the right to hereditary transmission of those benefits to their descendants. They were granted the title of Captain General and given authority over a fleet to be outfitted at Spanish expense. For men who had arrived as foreign-born petitioners with no standing in the Spanish system, these were remarkable concessions, and they reflected how seriously the Crown was taking the proposal. Not everyone was pleased. The opposition that gathered around the Magellan expedition before it had even left port was fierce, varied, and in some cases nakedly political. Spanish nobles at court objected to the elevation of Portuguese foreigners to positions of command and authority, and their resentment was not merely xenophobic. It touched real questions about who would control the expedition and who would profit from it. Juan de Aranda, a trading house official who had helped broker the deal with the Crown and may have negotiated a cut for himself, became a source of friction. The Bishop of Burgos, Juan Rodriguez de Fonseca, who effectively managed Spain's overseas empire, was sceptical and protective of established interests. Then there was Portugal. Word of the project reached Lisbon quickly, and King Manuel, who had so coldly dismissed Magellan not many years before, was alarmed enough to take active countermeasures. Portuguese agents were reportedly dispatched to Seville to monitor preparations, spread doubt about the venture among Spanish investors and officials, and potentially to disrupt or sabotage the outfitting of the fleet. The Portuguese ambassador lobbied the Spanish court directly. Manuel even sent messages to Magellan, suggesting that he might be received back into Portuguese service, an offer that Magellan appears to have rejected with something approaching contempt. What Portugal's intervention demonstrated, perhaps more clearly than anything else, was that Magellan's proposal was genuinely threatening. You don't mobilize diplomatic resources and intelligence networks to undermine a fantasy. The Portuguese understood that Magellan knew things, and that what he was proposing had a real chance of succeeding, and that success would damage them profoundly. Rui Falero, for his part, was increasingly becoming a complication rather than an asset, brilliant but unstable. He reportedly suffered from episodes of erratic behaviour that made courtiers and sailors alike uneasy. Before the fleet departed, he was quietly removed from the expedition. Exactly how and why remains somewhat murky, with accounts suggesting it may have been partly forced on him and partly a consequence of his own psychological deterioration. Magellan's partnership with Falero had served its purpose in getting the proposal to the king. The voyage itself would be his alone to lead. By the time the royal contract was sealed and preparations began in earnest, what Magellan had accomplished was this. He had turned a personal grievance, a decade of hard experience, a set of theoretical arguments, and a carefully navigated diplomatic negotiation into something real. 5 ships, a crew to be assembled, a mission that Spain had officially endorsed and Portugal had officially tried to prevent. The fleet was not yet built. The crew was not yet gathered. The passage had not yet been found. But the impossible had at least been sold, and the king had agreed to buy it. The king had agreed to buy it. Now someone had to actually build it. In the spring and summer of 1519, the harbour at Seville became the staging ground for one of the most ambitious logistical operations of the age. 5 ships were being fitted, provisioned, armed and crewed for a voyage whose duration no one could honestly predict, toward destinations that existed on maps as much as in reality, along a route that its commander had promised existed but had never actually travelled. The pressure of that uncertainty pressed down on every decision made in those months, and it would not lift until the fleet was long past the point of no return. The 5 ships were not equals. The flagship Trinidad displaced around 110 tons and carried Magellan himself, the heart of the operation and the vessel around which everything else was organized. The San Antonio was the largest in the fleet, closer to 120 tons, and she was the most heavily stocked, critical for long-haul provisioning. The Concepcion was a mid-sized vessel of around 90 tons, solid, if unremarkable. The Victoria, perhaps 85 tons, would ultimately become the most famous ship in the history of navigation, though nothing about her appearance at Seville in 1519 suggested she was destined to be the one that completed the circuit of the earth. The smallest was the Santiago, barely 75 tons, fast and manoeuvrable but fragile, suited more for scouting than for sustained ocean passages. Together they represented a significant investment by the Spanish crown, and inspectors who examined the ships before departure raised concerns that were not entirely misplaced. Some of the vessels were older than ideal, their hulls showing the kind of wear that long ocean voyages would exploit mercilessly. The crew that assembled around these ships was a striking and volatile mixture. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 237 and 270 men signed on for the voyage when it departed. They came from roughly a dozen different countries. There were Spaniards and Portuguese, naturally, but also Italians, Germans, Flemish, Greeks, Africans, Malays, and at least one Englishman. The Italian Antonio Pigafetta, a young Venetian nobleman who attached himself to the expedition out of what seems like pure intellectual adventure, would become the voyage's most important chronicler, and it is largely through his eyes that we experience what followed. The presence of so many nationalities in the crew was partly practical. Skilled sailors were drawn from wherever they could be found, but it also meant that shared language, loyalty, and purpose could never be assumed. The fleet carried within it the seeds of misunderstanding before it had raised a single sail. The command structure was the most dangerous instability of all. Magellan held the title of Captain General, the unambiguous head of the expedition. But the captains of the individual ships were in several cases men with their own loyalties, ambitions, and scepticism about serving under a Portuguese foreigner. Juan de Cartagena commanded the San Antonio and held the additional title of Conjunct Person, a somewhat ambiguous designation that may have been intended to give him oversight authority nearly equal to Magellan's, possibly inserted at the insistence of the Bishop of Burgos and other court figures who wanted a check on the Captain General's power. Gaspar de Quesada commanded the Concepcion. Luis de Mendoza commanded the Victoria. These were not men inclined toward quiet deference, and the arrangement placed Magellan in command over subordinates who had reason to believe, or at least to argue, that their authority came not just from him, but from the Spanish crown itself, a distinction that would matter enormously once the fleet was at sea and royal oversight was a very long way away. The distrust of Magellan as a Portuguese captain in Spanish service ran deeper than mere court politics. Among common sailors and officers alike, there was a persistent, whispered anxiety about where his ultimate loyalty lay. Portugal was Spain's rival. Magellan had served the Portuguese crown for years. He was taking a Spanish fleet into waters that Portugal considered its own domain, along a route he claimed to know through sources that may have included secret Portuguese charts. Even setting aside any questions about his honesty, the structural suspicion was difficult to escape. How do you fully trust a man who is leading you into competition with the country he once served? For some of the Spanish officers aboard those ships, the answer was that you don't. You watch him, you question him, and you wait for an opening to assert control. The logistical challenge of preparing the fleet added another layer of strain. The ships needed to carry enough food and water to sustain several hundred men for a voyage of unknown length. The official planning optimistically calculated for about 2 years, though no one truly knew. Provisions included salted meat, dried fish, biscuit, rice, beans, oil, and wine in quantities that were impressive on paper, but would prove agonizingly insufficient once the Pacific revealed its true dimensions. The holds were also stocked with trade goods, cloth, mirrors, bells, fishhooks, combs, and other items intended to facilitate commerce with the peoples they expected to encounter. Navigation instruments, compasses, astrolabes, quadrants, sand glasses, and rutters were loaded alongside the weapons, crossbows, artillery, arquebuses, swords, and armour. Portuguese interference continued throughout the outfitting. Agents in Seville were reportedly gathering intelligence on the fleet's preparations and doing what they could to sow doubt among Spanish officials and potential creditors. Whether or not they succeeded in causing concrete damage to the provisioning is difficult to establish with certainty, but at least some contemporary accounts suggest the ships left port with equipment and provisions that fell short of what had been requested, whether through sabotage, corruption, simple administrative failure, or some combination of all three. The result was a fleet that departed with fewer supplies than its Captain General had sought, a vulnerability that would cost lives before the voyage was half complete. On the 20th of September 1519, the fleet finally moved. It had been months in the making, years in the imagining, and it carried within it almost every source of conflict that would eventually threaten to destroy it: national rivalry, personal ambition, colonial suspicion, and the simple human tendency to fracture under pressure. The men who stood on those decks knew they were sailing into genuine uncertainty. Some of them believed in Magellan. Others had already decided, perhaps quietly, that they would not follow him wherever he chose to lead. The route ahead was unknown, The passage he had promised was not yet found, and the man commanding the fleet was surrounded by people who had every political, personal, and national reason to doubt him. That was the expedition that left Seville. Not a band of unified adventurers, but a floating argument, 5 ships carrying a mission that might change the world, already pulling against itself before the ocean had even come into view. The fleet that left Seville in September 1519 did not immediately plunge into the open Atlantic. It couldn't. The first leg of the voyage was a careful, almost cautious descent along familiar routes, south along the coast of Africa to the Canary Islands, where the ships stopped to take on final provisions and make last-minute repairs. It was in some ways the last moment of the ordinary. Beyond the Canaries lay the full Atlantic, and beyond that the theoretical geography of a passage no European had ever used, assuming it existed at all. Even before the fleet lost sight of the African coast, the tensions that had been simmering in Seville broke into the open. Magellan had chosen to communicate his course instructions to the other captains through sealed orders to be opened at sea, rather than briefing them directly before departure. To Juan de Cartagena, the commander of the San Antonio, who already believed his authority nearly matched Magellan's, this was not a tactical decision, it was a provocation. If he was supposed to share command, why was he being treated like a subordinate receiving orders? The question didn't stay internal for long. Once the fleet was under sail, Cartagena began pushing back, first in small ways, then more openly, challenging Magellan's route decisions and, critically, failing to give proper formal salutations when reporting to the flagship, a breach of maritime protocol that carried real meaning in the rigidly hierarchical world of early 16th century naval command. Magellan's response was swift and pointed. He had Cartagena arrested, removed from command of the San Antonio, and replaced him with another officer. It was a calculated act of dominance, executed before the fleet had even crossed the Atlantic, and it sent a message to every captain in the fleet about where authority actually resided. Some accepted the message. Others stored it away as evidence of the kind of high-handed behaviour they had suspected from Magellan all along. The arrest diffused the immediate standoff, but it did not dissolve the resentment underneath. The Atlantic crossing itself, measured against what was coming, was the manageable part. The fleet made the standard arc across the ocean, riding the trade wind southwest, reaching the coast of what is now Brazil by late November or early December 1519. They were in Portuguese claimed territory by the terms of the Treaty of Tordesillas, and Magellan was well aware of it, which may be partly why the fleet kept moving rather than making extended contact with local populations. What stops they did make were brief and, according to Pigafetta, often friendly. The crews found fresh food and water, rested, and made minor repairs. But the clock was ticking. The further south they sailed along South America's eastern coast, the closer they moved to waters that were genuinely unknown, and the season was advancing. This was where the geography began to dominate the psychology of the expedition. Every significant indentation in the South American coastline, every wide river mouth, every broad bay that opened promisingly to the west, became a candidate for the passage that Magellan had promised his king. The Rio de la Plata, where the Paraná and Uruguay rivers pour into a vast estuary that stretches nearly 200 kilometers across, was the most tempting of these. From a distance, it looked exactly like what they were searching for, a huge opening in the coast, with what appeared to be a clear path leading inland and perhaps beyond. Magellan sent ships to investigate. The water, however, was fresh, not the salt water of an ocean connection, but the outflow of an enormous river system draining the interior of the continent. The passage was not here. The disappointment was real, and it compounded with each similar moment as they continued south. The coast offered repeated variations on the same cruel theme, a promising opening, an investigation, and the eventual confirmation that it led nowhere useful. Every one of these false starts cost time, cost morale, and cost the confidence of men who had already been sceptical about whether the promised strait existed. Some of the officers, and likely many of the common sailors, were beginning to wonder aloud whether Magellan was chasing something that lived only in his imagination, or worse, in charts that he had misread or manufactured. Magellan himself left little direct record of what he felt during these weeks, which means we are largely dependent on Pigafetta's account and a handful of other sources that are not always consistent. What seems clear is that he remained outwardly certain, pressing the fleet southward even as the weather began to deteriorate. The South Atlantic in late summer is one thing. The South Atlantic in autumn, as the fleet was approaching latitudes that no European fleet had ever reached with any purpose of going further, was something else entirely. The air grew colder. The days shortened. The coastline, already bleak for long stretches, became increasingly hostile in appearance. Windswept, treeless, unfamiliar in ways that had nothing to do with maps. The further they moved from the tropics, the more the expedition felt the weight of genuine isolation. In the Caribbean, in Brazil, along the northern stretches of the South American coast, there had been at least a sense of proximity to something known: trade routes, Portuguese territories, the idea that if something went badly wrong, help was theoretically possible. Down here, that comfort evaporated. They were in waters where no rescue would come. The ships were their entire world, and those ships carried men who were cold, increasingly anxious, and running through the provisions that had already been loaded below their intended quantities. The question of where Magellan actually expected to find the Strait, how precise or vague his geographic confidence really was, remains genuinely contested. He clearly believed it existed. He seems to have believed it lay somewhere in this general region, south of the Rio de la Plata, but north of whatever the continent's southern extreme turned out to be. Whether he was working from actual chart evidence, from second-hand Portuguese intelligence he had absorbed during his years at the Lisbon court, or from a more intuitive geographic conviction, is difficult to say with certainty. What we know is that he kept moving, kept probing, kept insisting through his actions, if not always through his words, that the Strait was ahead. By the time the fleet reached the bay they would call San Julian, in what is now the Argentine province of Santa Cruz, the southern winter had arrived. The winds were brutal, progress had slowed, the provisions were not unlimited, and the fractured command structure that Magellan had tried to suppress back near the Canary Islands was preparing to reassert itself in the most dangerous way possible. The captains who had watched him arrest Cartagena, who had spent months accumulating grievances in the cold and the uncertainty, had decided that the moment for more than whispered dissent had come. The Strait was still ahead, still undiscovered, still waiting in the geography of a coast that offered nothing but cold water and false promises. But before Magellan could find it, he would have to survive what was building inside his own fleet. San Julian was not a place to linger. The bay offered shelter from the open Atlantic, which was something, but what surrounded it was about as inhospitable as the inhabited world had to offer. A flat, windswept plateau scraped clean by winds that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Vegetation so sparse it barely qualified as landscape, temperatures that dropped hard at night and didn't recover much by day. This was Patagonia in the austral winter of 1520. And it was where the expedition would spend the better part of 5 months. For men who had left Spain expecting a passage to warm Spice Islands, the psychological weight of that landscape pressing down on them day after day is not difficult to imagine. The decision to winter at San Julian rather than continue pushing south was strategically sound. The weather ahead would have been genuinely life-threatening, and the ships needed maintenance, the crews needed rest, and the provisions needed rationing carefully enough to last through whatever came next. But the decision also meant that all the tension that movement had been partially suppressing now had no outlet. There was nothing to do but wait, and while waiting, to think. The Spanish captains had a great deal to think about. Their grievances were not trivial, and it would be a mistake to dismiss them simply as treachery. Cartagena, Gaspar de Quesada of the Concepcion, and Luis de Mendoza of the Victoria had specific, compounding reasons for what they were about to do. Magellan had reduced rations. The captains believed unfairly and without proper consultation. He had consistently bypassed the advisory structure that his own articles of command technically required, making unilateral decisions on course, anchorage, and procedure. He was a Portuguese national commanding a Spanish royal expedition, and that fact never stopped chafing. They were cold. They were stuck. They were hungry enough to notice it, and the strait that had been promised as a certainty somewhere along this coast had produced nothing but disappointment for months, from their perspective. And it's worth sitting with this for a moment. Following Magellan, further into the unknown, wasn't loyalty. It was recklessness in service of another man's obsession. The mutiny launched on the night of April 1st, 1520, moving with the kind of speed that suggested planning far more sophisticated than a spontaneous uprising. Quesada led a party aboard the San Antonio, overcame its loyalist officer in a violent struggle. The officer was stabbed several times, though he survived, and took control of the ship. Mendoza was already in command of the Victoria. Cartagena, though technically still under arrest from the confrontation months earlier, had been kept aboard one of the vessels and aligned himself with the rebels. 3 of the 5 ships were now in hostile hands. Magellan held only the Trinidad, his flagship, and the Santiago. What the mutineers likely expected was negotiation. They had the numbers. They had the ships. They sent a letter to Magellan outlining their demands and, implicitly, their leverage. What they may not have fully accounted for was that Magellan had been waiting for something like this, and that waiting had sharpened him rather than exhausted him. His response was neither slow nor diplomatic. He moved first against the Victoria, sending a small boat to Mendoza under the pretence of delivering a reply to the rebel letter. The men in that boat included Gonzalo Gomez de Espinosa, his chief constable, who handed the letter to Mendoza and then stabbed him in the throat before Mendoza could fully process what was happening. A second boat arrived immediately after with more armed men, and the Victoria was seized before its crew could organize a coherent defense. Mendoza was dead. The fleet balance had shifted in the space of minutes. Magellan then moved to block the mouth of the harbour, positioning his 3 ships to prevent any exit. The San Antonio and the Concepcion were trapped. When the San Antonio tried to break through during the night, the Trinidad and its accompanying vessels met it with artillery and boarding parties. After a brief and costly exchange, the ship surrendered. Quesada was taken prisoner. Cartagena found himself under arrest again. The mutiny that had controlled 3 ships was broken within roughly a day of launching, through a combination of calculated violence, tactical positioning, and a willingness to act before his opponents could consolidate their advantage. What followed was not magnanimous. Mendoza, already dead, was drawn and quartered, his body made an example even in death. Quesada was beheaded by his own servant, whom Magellan offered clemency in exchange for performing the execution, a gruesome piece of psychological theatre that forced the servant to participate in killing his own commander, or face death himself. 40 men had been involved in the mutiny to varying degrees. Magellan could not execute 40 men. He needed sailors far more than he needed to make every possible example, so most received pardoned sentences, or were put to hard labour repairing the ships. But the penalties at the top were severe and public, designed to be remembered. Cartagena's fate was perhaps the strangest. Magellan did not execute him outright, possibly because he held a royal commission that made summary execution legally and politically complicated, or possibly for reasons we can't now fully reconstruct. Instead, when the fleet finally departed San Julian months later, Cartagena and a priest named Pedro Sanchez de la Reina, who had also been implicated in the rebellion, were marooned on the Patagonian shore, left behind with food and wine, but without passage home, left in effect at the end of the world. What became of them afterward is unknown. They were never seen again. The mutiny and its aftermath illuminated something about Magellan that is genuinely difficult to assess cleanly. He was ruthless when challenged, that much is beyond question. The speed and precision of his counterattacks suggest a commander who had thought through contingencies, who anticipated betrayal and had prepared for it. That kind of operational clarity in a crisis is not nothing. But the months leading up to the mutiny also reveal a man whose management style created the conditions for it. The reduced rations without consultation, the exclusion of his captains from decision-making, the accumulated contempt for the advisory structures he was supposed to work within, these were not accidents of personality. They were choices, and they had consequences. The expedition was genuinely fragile at San Julian. One ship, the Santiago, would be lost to a storm during a scouting mission shortly after the mutiny, its crew rescued but the vessel destroyed. The fleet that had left Seville with 5 ships was now down to 4, was wintering in a place that offered nothing but hardship, and was commanded by a man who had just executed 2 officers and marooned 2 more. Whatever the sailors thought of Magellan's leadership, and they thought very different things, none of them could doubt his willingness to do whatever the moment required. Spring in the southern hemisphere comes in October. The winds eventually shifted, the days lengthened, and the fleet, battered and diminished and bound together now by something closer to fear than to shared purpose, turned its prows south again toward the coast that still refused to reveal where or whether the passage existed. They moved south in October 1520, 4 ships instead of 5, carrying the memory of San Julian like ballast they couldn't offload. The coastline continued doing what it had done for months, running southward, offering nothing but more of itself, headland after headland folding into the next without any sign of the break they were searching for. The crews had been told there was a passage. Magellan had staked his life, his reputation, and arguably the entire project of the voyage on his belief that one existed somewhere along this shore. But belief and geography don't always cooperate, and the coast was not in a hurry to confirm anything. The first crack in the monotony came near what is now known as Cape Virgines, where the shoreline suddenly opened into something that looked different, a wide bay angling inland and westward, broader at the mouth than the false channels they had already wasted days exploring. There was reason for scepticism. They had been deceived by promising inlets before, each one eventually narrowing into nothing, salt marsh or dead-end river, mouth swallowing their hopes quietly. Magellan sent 2 ships ahead to investigate, the San Antonio and the Concepcion, with orders to probe the bay and return within 5 days with whatever they had found. What happened next began as catastrophe. A violent storm swept in from the east, driving both ships deep into the bay before their crews could react, and for the men watching from the Trinidad and the Victoria, the sight of their companions disappearing into churning water and weather must have looked very much like watching them die. There was nothing to do but hold position and wait. And waiting under those circumstances, not knowing, not being able to help, listening to the wind work itself into sustained violence, is its own particular kind of suffering. The ships came back. They came back flying flags and firing guns. They came back with news that the bay did not close. The bay kept going, and not just going. It twisted and branched through channels that opened into more channels, channels that showed tidal surges rather than the freshwater flow of a river, which meant this was not a river. Saltwater tides meant connection to another ocean. The passage was real. What followed was the navigational ordeal that the discovery only made possible. The strait that now bears Magellan's name is not a corridor. It is a labyrinth. It runs for roughly 570 kilometers through terrain that seems specifically designed to disorient. The channels split and rejoin. The currents shift and fight each other. Winds funnel through the surrounding mountains and come off the glaciers with sudden savagery, then die entirely, leaving ships becalmed in passages narrow enough that both shores feel dangerously close. The surrounding landscape, snow-streaked peaks, dense forest pressing to the waterline, glacier tongues reaching toward the sea, is extraordinary in a way that has nothing to do with comfort. These were not conditions that invited confidence. Navigation here required constant sounding for depth, constant attention to weather changes that arrived without much warning, and a tolerance for uncertainty that tested even experienced sailors. Magellan moved through all of it with what his chronicler Antonio Pigafetta described as visible emotion when the strait was confirmed, one of the few moments where the record suggests something cracking open in the man's otherwise composed exterior. According to Pigafetta, he wept, whether from relief, from vindication, from the sheer accumulated pressure of having staked everything on this and found it, we can't say with certainty. But the detail feels honest precisely because Pigafetta had no obvious reason to invent it. Then came the desertion. The San Antonio was the largest ship in the fleet, carrying a substantial portion of the expedition's remaining provisions. Its pilot, Esteban Gomez, had his own ambitions and his own grievances. He had proposed a different route to the Spice Islands before the voyage departed, a northwesterly passage through the North Atlantic, and Magellan had dismissed the idea. There is some evidence suggesting coordination, or at least opportunity seized. Whatever the precise motivation, the San Antonio turned around. It did not return after being sent on a reconnaissance run. It reversed course, navigated back through the strait, and sailed for Spain, taking with it the bulk of the fleet's food supply and carrying its captain, Alvaro de Mesquita, a Magellan loyalist, in chains to account for the return. The effect on what remained of the fleet was immediate and serious. Magellan now had 3 ships. He had dramatically reduced provisions. He had a crew that watched one of their largest vessels simply sail away and understood, with that image fixed in their minds, exactly how far from home they were, and exactly how tenuous the thread connecting them to survival had become. There are accounts suggesting Magellan held a council after the San Antonio's disappearance was confirmed, waiting, sending search parties, accepting the reality gradually, and that some of his remaining officers urged turning back. The argument was not unreasonable. They had found the strait, which could be reported. They could return with that knowledge and resupply for a proper second attempt. Magellan refused. What he said, according to some versions of the record, was that he would press forward even if they had to eat the leather on the ship's rigging. It has the sound of something rehearsed for posterity, but the decision itself was real, and the consequences of it would define the next several months in ways no one aboard could have fully anticipated. On November 28, 1520, 3 ships emerged from the western mouth of the strait into water that was almost impossibly calm. They had been told stories about the sea of darkness beyond the known maps. What they found instead was an ocean of extraordinary tranquility, so unlike the battering they had endured in the Atlantic, and the strait that Magellan named it the Pacific, the peaceful sea. The name would prove somewhat ironic, but the moment itself deserves to be recognized for what it was. The strait was not simply a navigational discovery, it was proof of concept at a scale that reorganized how the world understood itself. For the first time in recorded history, a European fleet had connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans by water, passing through the southern tip of an entire continent and emerging on the other side. The geography of the Earth had just been demonstrated to be continuous in a way that theory had suggested, but no one had confirmed. Every map drawn afterward would have to account for what those 3 ships had just done. The men didn't know that yet, of course. What they knew was that the passage was behind them, that the ocean ahead was wide and still and glittering, and that they were sailing into it with fewer ships, fewer provisions, and less certainty about what lay ahead than they had started with. But they were sailing. The edge of the known world had not been an edge at all. It had been a door, and they had just walked through it. The name was an act of optimism, or perhaps exhaustion. The ocean looked peaceful, felt peaceful in those first days, and after the violence of the Strait and the Atlantic before it, peaceful was exactly what the men needed to believe they were entering. Magellan called it the Pacific, Mar Pacifico, and the name embedded itself in history. What he could not have known, what no European could have known, was that he had just given a tranquil name to the largest body of water on Earth, and that the crossing ahead would become one of the most punishing, sustained ordeals in the history of exploration. The miscalculation was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of information, and the two are very different things. Every European estimate of the Pacific's width, including Magellan's, was built on a compounded series of errors that ran back through decades of geographical theory. The size of the Earth had been underestimated. The width of the American continents had been underestimated, and the space between South America's western shore and the Asian archipelagos, the islands that held the spices that made the whole enterprise worth attempting, had been so dramatically compressed in the prevailing mental map of the world that the actual crossing distance was perhaps 3 times what anyone on those 3 ships believed it to be. Magellan expected weeks. The ocean would give him months. They sailed north and then northwest, looking for the trade winds that would carry them toward the Moluccas. The winds cooperated, at least in that sense. They found a reliable push and rode it. For a time, the sailing itself was almost exactly what Magellan had promised it would be. No storms, no treacherous coasts, no tortured straits demanding constant decision under pressure. Just open water, blue and wide, the horizon holding nothing but more horizon. And then the horizon kept doing that, week after week. The supplies began running down with a speed that grew alarming, because supplies calculated for a crossing of a certain length do not scale gracefully when the crossing turns out to be much longer. The biscuit, hardtack, the sailor's staple, began to rot and then to crawl. What the men ate was no longer really food in any conventional sense. Pigafetta's account, which is the most detailed record we have of these weeks, describes biscuit reduced to powder and yellow with the urine of rats, and the rats themselves becoming a commodity. Men paid money for rats. They ate leather straps softened over days in salt water. The leather comment that Magellan had reportedly made in defiance, that they would eat the rigging before they turned back, had stopped being rhetoric and was becoming operational planning. Scurvy moved through the crews with the quiet efficiency of something that knows it has time. The disease caused by vitamin C deficiency doesn't announce itself all at once. It begins as fatigue, as loosening teeth, as gums that bleed too easily. It progresses to joint pain so severe that standing becomes an exercise in managing agony. Wounds that should have healed reopened. Men who had been strong enough to manage a ship through the Strait of Magellan were reduced to lying below decks, too weak to move, watching the ceiling and waiting. At least 19 men died during the Pacific crossing, possibly more. The records are incomplete and the accounting uncertain. Others survived in states that left permanent damage. Navigation through all of this required a particular kind of stubborn precision. In the Atlantic, sailors could feel their way along coastlines, find landmarks, stop at ports that had supplied European ships before. The Pacific offered almost nothing equivalent. The few islands they encountered, too, by the accounts, both small and offering little of what the crews desperately needed, were not enough to count as relief. What Magellan and his pilots were doing instead was dead reckoning carried to an extreme length, tracking estimated speed against time, calculating latitude from the position of the sun and stars, trying to maintain a sense of where they were in an ocean that gave them almost nothing to fix a position against. The Southern Cross, visible in those latitudes, served as one reference. The behavior of certain birds, the presence of floating debris, the temperature changes of the water, all of it was read and interpreted by men who were simultaneously starving and trying to hold a course. The expertise involved is easy to underestimate from a distance. These were not guesses. They were educated calculations performed under conditions that would have broken most people before the calculations were finished. What the records suggest, and what Pigafetta conveys without quite articulating it directly, is that the psychological weight of the crossing may have been as destructive as the physical deprivation. Human beings are not well designed for emptiness of this duration and scale. 3 months on an ocean that offered no feedback, No confirmation that the distance was closing. No visible evidence that there was anything on the other side. This is a specific kind of suffering. You cannot fight the Pacific. You cannot negotiate with it. You can only endure it. An endurance that goes on past its expected end begins to hollow people out in ways that calorie counts don't capture. The men began to doubt. Not necessarily the obvious doubt whether they would survive, but the deeper doubt about whether the ocean they were crossing was the ocean they thought it was, whether the information was wrong, whether the islands that were supposed to be there actually existed, whether the world beyond the strait was what they had been told, or whether they were sailing into a space that simply continued, blue and indifferent, until whatever remained of them sank below the surface. History remembers the Pacific crossing as something that happened and ended. The men living inside it had no access to that perspective. For them it was ongoing, and ongoing with diminishing reason to believe it would stop. What held them together is not entirely clear. Magellan's command had an iron quality that the record consistently supports, even when the record is written by men who had reason to resent him. His certainty, or at least his performance of certainty, may have been more important to the fleet's survival than any navigational calculation. Crews who have lost faith in a voyage find ways to end it. These crews kept sailing through the starvation and the scurvy and the emptiness, in the direction their captain pointed. On March 6, 1521, roughly 98 days after leaving the strait, land appeared, real land, substantial land, the island group now known as the Marianas. There was fresh water. There was food. Men who had been too weak to stand found the motivation that only relief from suffering can generate. The crisis was not over. The voyage had months left in it, and harder things ahead, but the Pacific had finally, after almost unimaginable resistance, given them something solid to stand on. The ocean that had looked peaceful on a November afternoon had exacted a price that redefined what the word crossing was allowed to mean. No one who sailed it that first time could have described the Pacific as a known quantity afterward. They had moved through something vast and largely indifferent and survived it. The world they were mapping was turning out to be far less forgiving than the maps had suggested. The Marianas were life, but they were not simple. The moment the ships anchored, the local Chamorro people experienced confident mariners in their own right, with a trading culture that extended across significant stretches of the western Pacific, came out to the vessels with a directness that surprised the crew. They were not frightened by the ships, not awed into cautious distance. They climbed aboard, they took things by the standards of a European expedition operating on the edge of collapse. The distinction between trade and theft blurred quickly, and the incident that followed says as much about the desperation of the fleet as it does about the islanders' intentions. When a skiff was taken, or perceived to have been taken, Magellan responded with a punitive raid. Houses burned. Men were killed. It was a brutal opening to what would become a complicated chapter, and it set a template the expedition would struggle to move beyond. Contact initiated in exhaustion and anxiety, misunderstanding accelerated by cultural distance, violence arriving before understanding had a chance to take root. They renamed the islands the Ladrones, the Thieves, a name born of that fractured first encounter, and it stuck in European records for generations, which tells you something about whose account of the meeting got to define the memory. The Chamorro people, of course, had a different experience of the same events, though their version would take much longer to be heard. What the records emphasize is the supplies, the fresh water, the fruit, the food that began restoring men who had been weeks from death. That urgency was real, and it explains some of what happened, even if it doesn't excuse it. From the Marianas, the fleet pushed west and south, and on March 16, 1521, they raised the island of Samar at the eastern edge of what we now call the Philippines. The archipelago they had reached was not empty space on a map. It was one of the most culturally and politically intricate regions in that part of the world, a web of chiefdoms, trading relationships, and competing loyalties that had been developing for centuries without any reference to European ambition. If the Marianas had been a painful preview of how difficult contact could become, the Philippines would be the full lesson. What changed the character of those early interactions almost immediately was something Magellan could not have anticipated. One of the men on his ship could actually communicate. Enrique, sometimes called Henry of Malacca, had sailed with Magellan for years and spoke a language that the people they encountered here could understand. The significance of that single fact is difficult to overstate, not just for the practical ease it introduced into negotiations, but for what it implied geographically, that they had reached waters close enough to Malacca, to the trading world Enrique knew, that the linguistic threads connected. They were, in a meaningful sense, approaching the world the expedition had set out to reach. Enrique has sometimes been described as the first person to complete a circumnavigation in the sense of having travelled all the way around his own origin point, which is a claim that historians debate, but the possibility is worth holding because it complicates the story in interesting ways. Early contacts in the Philippines moved with a delicacy that contrasted sharply with the Marianas' encounter. Gifts were exchanged: silk, red caps, mirrors, the small glossy trade goods that European expeditions carried specifically for these moments. Local rulers came aboard or received Magellan in their own spaces, and the ceremonies around those meetings carried real weight. Raja Kalambu of Limasawa proved a willing interlocutor, and through Enrique the fleet navigated something more nuanced than the brute exchange of the Ladrones' stock. Food arrived in genuine abundance. Alliances, however tentative, began to form. Then religion entered the picture, and the nature of the voyage shifted perceptibly. Magellan had never conceived of this expedition as purely commercial. The conversion of non-Christian peoples was not an afterthought to Spanish imperial expansion. It was woven into the justification, the theology, and in some cases the genuine personal conviction of the people involved. Magellan appears to have believed, and the record supports this more than cynicism might suggest, that bringing Christianity to the islands he encountered was as real a mission as delivering spices to Seville. He oversaw a mass baptism on the island of Cebu that attracted hundreds of participants, including Raja Humabon, the most significant local ruler the fleet had yet encountered. Whether those baptisms represented genuine conversion, diplomatic performance, or some layered combination of both, that question is probably unanswerable, and the honest approach is to hold all three possibilities simultaneously. What it clearly did represent, from the expedition's side, was a kind of success that transformed the fleet's sense of itself. They were no longer just survivors of an ocean crossing. They were emissaries of empire and faith, and the ambition that had driven the expedition since Seville began reasserting itself over the survival calculus that had dominated everything else for months. But ambitions that reassert themselves after a near-death experience sometimes reassert themselves with distorted confidence. Magellan began operating in the Philippines less like a navigator passing through and more like a governor arriving to stay. He involved himself in local politics with an engagement that went beyond what the expedition's safety required. Raja Humabon had a rival, a chieftain, on the nearby island of Mactan named Lapu-Lapu, who had declined to acknowledge either Humabon's supremacy or the authority of the Spanish king that Magellan was now projecting onto the region. Lapu-Lapu's refusal was a local political fact with its own history, its own logic, its own texture. From where Magellan stood, flushed with the success of the Cebu baptisms, emboldened by the alliances he had made, perhaps convinced that the power of his ships and his cause was self-evident, it may have looked like a problem with an obvious solution. His officers advised caution. The record suggests that more than one of them questioned whether an armed confrontation with Mactan was necessary, or wise, or connected in any meaningful way to getting the ships to the Spice Islands and home again. Magellan, who had held the fleet together through mutiny and starvation, and 3 months of Pacific emptiness partly through the force of his own certainty, did not take easily to being argued out of a decision. The very quality that had made him an effective commander through the worst of the voyage, the refusal to accept limitation, the forward-leaning insistence that the next obstacle could be overcome, was now directing itself at a small island and its unbending chief. The fleet had crossed the largest ocean on Earth and arrived on the other side transformed by the experience. The men were alive who might easily not have been. The ships were provisioned, the alliances made, the missionaries and the traders both finding reasons to be encouraged. It had the feeling, in those days on Cebu, of a voyage that had survived its worst, and was now opening into something different. What it was actually opening into was Mactan, and whatever confidence the Pacific crossing had built, the island ahead was about to test it in ways no one on the fleet had fully calculated. The morning of April 27th, 1521, began with a decision that, in hindsight, carries the specific weight of tragedy, not the inevitable kind, but the kind that could have gone differently at almost any point along the way. Magellan had decided to lead the assault on Mactan himself, not to direct it from the ships, not to send a contingent under a trusted officer while he remained with the fleet, but to wade ashore with his men and demonstrate in person the power that his new alliance with Humabon was supposed to represent. The tactical situation was disadvantageous before the first shot was fired. Mactan's shoreline was shallow and reef-studded, which meant the ships could not get close enough to provide meaningful covering fire. The cannons that had been the expedition's great equalizer in every tense encounter since the Rio de la Plata sat uselessly at range, unable to depress low enough to hit the beach, unable to bring their weight to bear on the fighting that was about to unfold. Magellan appears to have known this, or should have, and the fact that he proceeded anyway is one of the more debated elements of what happened. He brought roughly 60 men in small boats that had to anchor in the shallows, forcing the landing party to wade through chest-high water toward a beach where somewhere between several hundred and 1,000 warriors, the estimates vary significantly depending on the source, were already assembled and waiting. Lapu-Lapu's men had the advantages of ground, preparation and numbers. They knew the terrain, they had had time to organize, and critically they understood something about the Spanish weapons that the expedition had perhaps allowed itself to forget, that firearms and crossbows, however terrifying in the right conditions, are slow to reload, and a man with a spear who closes the distance fast enough can reach you between shots. The Mactan warriors did exactly that. They pressed forward aggressively, targeting the men in the water before they could establish any kind of formation on the beach, and they directed their efforts with what the expedition's chronicler Pigafetta describes as particular attention to the legs of the wading attackers, the one part of the body not covered by armour. Magellan was wounded early. An arrow or a dart struck his leg, and then, in the close fighting that followed, a spear or bamboo lance hit him in the face. He kept fighting. What Pigafetta's account makes clear, and what has struck readers ever since, is that Magellan stayed in the water covering the retreat of his men even as the situation collapsed around him. The beach could not be held, the boats could not get closer. The warriors pressing in from the shore were not the disorganized resistance that the campaign against Humabon's rivals may have led the landing party to expect. Magellan fell somewhere in that churning shallow water, surrounded by men who had successfully defended their island against the crew of the first expedition to have crossed the Pacific Ocean. The shock that reached the ships must have been immediate and destabilizing in ways that go beyond the simple loss of a commander. These men had crossed the Atlantic, survived winter in Patagonia, forced a passage through a strait that most of them had doubted existed, crossed 3 months of open Pacific, and arrived where they were partly because of their belief, however complicated, however tested, in Magellan's capacity to find a way through. He had been the organizing intelligence of the expedition for 2 years. He had out-argued, outmaneuvered, and outlasted every challenge to his authority. And now he was gone, in a skirmish on a small island, in a battle that the expedition had not needed to fight. The interpretations of why Magellan chose to take that risk have accumulated over the centuries without fully settling into consensus. Some historians emphasize the religious dimension, that his commitment to Humabon's newly baptized community was genuine enough that he felt a real obligation to defend it, that Lapu-Lapu's defiance represented not just a political inconvenience, but a threat to the Christian project he had come to see as inseparable from the voyage. Others point to the accumulation of success in the Philippines as a kind of intoxicant, the way that a run of good outcomes can erode the caution that harder times install. There is also the possibility, and it is worth considering without overstating, that Magellan had absorbed enough of the chivalric tradition of his era to feel that leading from the front was not merely tactically indicated, but morally required, that a captain who sent others into danger he himself avoided was something less than a captain. Any of these explanations may carry part of the answer, and none of them is sufficient on its own. What we can say with more confidence is that the qualities that brought him to Mactan were not separable from the qualities that had brought him this far. The same refusal to treat obstacles as final that had kept the expedition moving through mutiny, through starvation, through the Strait's labyrinthine channels. That same refusal was present on the beach at Mactan, directed now at a problem that did not yield to sheer will. He had survived so much by insisting that survival was possible on April 27th. That insistence met something it could not overcome. The mission did not end with his death, but it was transformed by it in ways that would define everything that followed. Until Mactan, the expedition had a commander whose authority was established, whose vision for the voyage had a coherent shape, and whose presence held together men who had every reason to fracture. After Mactan, what remained was a leadership vacuum that the surviving officers would spend weeks filling badly, a fleet that had lost its organizing will, and a crew that now had to find its own reasons to keep going. The heroic command structure, the story in which one man's extraordinary capacity pushes the expedition through, simply ceased to exist on that beach. What replaced it was something more fragile, more fractious, and in some ways more interesting. A group of men trying to complete a thing whose original architect was dead, navigating a world he had helped them reach without any longer having his judgment available to them. The voyage was not over, but it was different now. Everything that came next, the betrayal at Cebu, the burning of a ship, the grueling attempt to reach the Spice Islands under new and disputed command, happened in the absence of the one person who had conceived of the enterprise and forced it into existence. Magellan had sailed beyond every map and survived. He had not survived what was waiting for him just inside the world he had worked so hard to reach. The leadership vacuum Magellan left behind did not stay empty for long. It simply filled with the wrong things. The surviving officers elected two commanders to replace him, Duarte Barbosa, Magellan's own brother-in-law, and João Serrão, one of the more experienced pilots in the fleet. It was a reasonable attempt to restore order. It lasted less than a week. Humabon, the Cebuano king, whose alliance had seemed so promising, whose baptism had been one of the expedition's celebrated achievements in the Philippines, had been watching carefully since Mactan. What he saw was a fleet whose fearsome commander was dead, whose men were depleted, and whose cannons, so intimidating at a distance, were crewed by people who were now visibly uncertain about what to do next. Whatever his precise calculations, the result was an invitation to the expedition's officers to attend a feast ashore. Most of the senior men went. The ship's crews who remained on board heard screaming from the beach. Serrão was dragged to the waterline and called out to the ships to ransom him. The fleet's commanders debated whether rescuing him was even possible without walking into the same trap. They decided it was not, or perhaps simply that the risk was too great. The ships pulled away. Serrão's fate remains unclear. Some accounts suggest he was killed shortly after, others that he survived for a time in some form of captivity. But either way, he never came back aboard. The expedition had now lost, in a single week, its original commander and most of its replacement leadership in circumstances that combined bad judgment, betrayal, and the specific vulnerability of men who had arrived in a region they did not fully understand. What remained was a fleet of 3 ships, and somewhere around 115 men, considerably fewer than the 270 who had left Sanlúcar de Barrameda. And 3 ships was 1 ship too many. The math was blunt and unavoidable. There simply were not enough men left to crew 3 vessels adequately through what everyone understood would be a demanding and dangerous continuation of the voyage. The solution they reached was brutal in its practicality. The Concepcion, one of the original 5 ships, was stripped of anything useful and then burned. Watching one of your own ships catch fire and go down is not a neutral act. It removes the option of turning back, concentrates resources in what remains, and announces to everyone still alive that there is only one direction left. 2 ships pushed on the Trinidad and the Victoria. Command eventually consolidated around João Lopes Carvalho, and then, more durably, around Gonzalo Gómez de Espinosa on the Trinidad and Juan Sebastián Elcano on the Victoria, names that would carry the expedition through its final, extraordinary arc. But before the Spice Islands could become anything other than an objective on a Portuguese map, the fleet had to navigate the dense and complicated web of maritime Southeast Asia, a region that turned out to be nothing like the blank space European cartographers had left there. The waters between the Philippines and the Moluccas were alive with commerce. Arab traders, Javanese merchants, Chinese junks. The trade networks here had been functioning for centuries before any European had laid eyes on them, and the expedition found itself moving through a world of established relationships, competitive politics, and sophisticated exchange that demanded something different from what had gotten them across the Pacific. Brute endurance and astronomical navigation had brought them this far. What survival required now was diplomacy, local knowledge, and the willingness to engage as traders rather than conquerors. The fleet stopped at multiple islands, negotiated for food and water, acquired pilots who actually knew these waters in the way that the expedition's own navigators never could, and traded carefully from their dwindling stock of goods. The commodities they had brought from Spain, cloth, mirrors, glass beads, the standard catalogue of European trade goods, had wildly variable value depending on where they were and who they were dealing with. Sometimes the calculations worked, sometimes they didn't, and the fleet moved on hungry. There were moments of genuine danger that never made it into the cleaner versions of the story. A near confrontation with a well-armed local vessel. Stretches of coast, where it was unclear whether landing would be welcomed or resisted. The constant negotiation between the urgency to reach the Spice Islands and the practical necessity of not arriving there with a crew too weak and a hold too empty to conduct the actual business they had come to do. The men who survived this phase of the voyage were learning, rapidly and without much margin for error, that the East was not simply a destination to be reached. It was a place with its own logic, its own power structures, and its own expectations of the people who wanted to participate in its trade. And then, in November of 1521, 2 years and 2 months after leaving Spain, the remaining ships of the Armada de Molucca finally reached Tidor. In the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, the moment deserves to land with its full weight. These islands had been the entire justification for the voyage, the destination that had been named in Magellan's original proposal to the Spanish crown, the place that had organised every calculation about routes and returns and profit. Men had died of scurvy in the Pacific, partly because of the arithmetic of reaching this place. The mutiny at San Julian, the forced passage of the Strait, the brutal crossing, all of it had been in service of this arrival. And there they were, cloves growing on hillsides, the most valuable commodity per unit weight in the world at that moment, available for trade at prices that made the losses of the voyage look, at least in the ledger book version of history, almost recoverable. The Sultan of Tidor received them. Portuguese influence was strong in the Moluccas, and the fact that this was a Spanish expedition created political complications that required careful handling, but handle them they did. They traded. They filled the ship's holds with cloves, with as much as the hulls could carry and the men could load. After everything the voyage had cost, the 5 ships reduced to 2, the captains lost, the crew that had sailed from Spain more than halved, they had reached the place they came for, and they were loading it with the thing they had come to find. It was not a triumphant scene in the way that celebrations are usually imagined. These were exhausted, diminished, grief-carrying men in ships that had been at sea for over 2 years, but the holds were filling with cloves. The Spice Islands were real. The route was real. Whatever came next, and what came next was far from simple. They had proved that the world could be approached from this direction, and they had the cargo to show for it. The voyage, improbably, still had a long way to go. The holds were full of cloves, the crews were as rested as men in their condition could be, and the next question, the question that had been building since before they left Spain, was how to get home. 2 routes existed in theory. They could turn back east across the Pacific, retrace the ocean they had barely survived on the way out, and return the way they had come. Or they could continue west, cross the Indian Ocean, round the southern tip of Africa, and complete the circle. Neither option was safe, neither option was simple. But the eastward route had one problem that settled the argument almost immediately. The winds wouldn't cooperate. The Pacific, as they had learned at brutal cost, was not a body of water you crossed on a whim in whatever direction suited your schedule. The prevailing winds and currents that had pushed them westward on the outbound voyage would work against a return the same way. For the Trinidad, which was taking on water and needed repairs before attempting anything, a Pacific return became a separate plan. She would try it once her hull was fixed, carrying her own cargo back through the ocean the expedition had already named. For the Victoria, the decision was made, west, through the Indian Ocean, and home. Elcano took the Victoria out of the Moluccas in December of 1521, with a crew of around 60 men, a mix of the original European sailors and a number of local crew members they had taken on in the islands. 60 men for one ship sounds manageable until you remember what they were attempting. The Indian Ocean is not the Atlantic. It is not a crossing that Iberian sailors had spent generations learning. The Portuguese knew it, had mapped it, fought over it, built their empire upon it, and that familiarity was precisely the problem. Every port on the Indian Ocean's rim was potentially a Portuguese port, every vessel on its waters potentially a Portuguese vessel, and the Victoria was sailing through a zone of active Portuguese commercial and military control, carrying a cargo that Portugal considered, by treaty and by right of prior discovery, to belong to them. Elcano's ship was not simply racing to get home, it was evading the most powerful naval force operating in those waters. The route they chose tried to thread through this danger by swinging far to the south, away from the coasts where Portuguese patrols concentrated, through the open ocean below Madagascar, and down toward the latitudes where the westerly winds could carry them around the Cape of Good Hope. The logic was sound. The experience was almost unsurvivable. The southern Indian Ocean is one of the roughest bodies of water on the planet. The winds they were counting on to drive them westward are the same winds that make the seas below 40 degrees south latitude a place where ships break apart with some regularity, even under favourable circumstances. The Victoria was not in favourable circumstances. She had been at sea for 2.5 years. Her hull had been repaired with the tools and materials available in the Pacific Islands, which is to say imperfectly, with improvisation layering on improvisation. Her rigging had been replaced and repaired in ways that revealed themselves under stress. The men working her were not the veteran crew that had left Spain. They were the survivors of a voyage that had killed more than half the people it had started with, men who were already carrying the physical damage of malnutrition and tropical illness. The storms found them. Not one storm, but a sustained ordeal of heavy weather that lasted weeks, battering a ship that had no business being where it was. The cold was a particular shock after the tropics. Men who had sweated through the Pacific and the Spice Islands were suddenly in waters cold enough to be genuinely dangerous, without adequate clothing or protection because no one had planned for this. The food situation deteriorated. They had loaded provisions in the Moluccas, but the southern route took longer than expected. The storms consumed time and distance, and the strict rationing that had defined much of the voyage became stricter still. Rice, a little protein. Whatever could be stretched. Men who had survived Magellan's Pacific crossing only to reload their bodies in the Spice Islands found themselves emptying out again, the same scurvy symptoms reappearing, the same weakness in the joints, and bleeding in the gums that had defined the worst days of the Pacific. 22 men died on the crossing from the Moluccas to the Cape of Good Hope. 22 more names, more bodies consigned to an ocean they never expected to cross. The crew that had begun at 60 was wearing down toward 40, and they had not yet rounded Africa. They rounded Africa. Barely, but they did. The Cape of Good Hope lived up to the irony of its name by being nearly the end of the Victoria rather than the hopeful turning point the name implies. But she made it through, and the Atlantic opened up ahead of them, an ocean that Spanish and Portuguese sailors actually knew, a crossing that had been routine for decades, an environment that should have felt almost familiar after everything they had been through. Instead, it nearly finished them. The remaining food was almost gone. The crew was in no condition for extended sailing. Elcano made a calculation that shows exactly how desperate things had become. He decided to put in at the Cape Verde Islands, Portuguese territory, to take on supplies. This was not a comfortable decision. The Cape Verde Islands were Portuguese, which meant that a Spanish ship arriving with a hold full of cloves from the Moluccas was walking directly into a legal and military trap. But the alternative, pushing north on the Atlantic, with a crew dying of hunger and scurvy, was no alternative at all. They went in. They managed to trade carefully, and with a cover story about having crossed the Atlantic from the Americas rather than the Indian Ocean, trying to disguise the cargo and the route. It almost worked. Then one of the shore parties was arrested. The Portuguese knew, or suspected enough. Elcano didn't wait to find out how much they knew. He pulled his reduced crew back aboard, leaving 13 men stranded on the island, taken by the Portuguese, and the Victoria ran for it, back into the Atlantic, north toward Spain, with whatever food they had managed to acquire, and however many men still had enough left in them to work the ship. 18 men brought the Victoria into the port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda on September 6, 1522, 18 Europeans out of the 270 who had left, plus a handful of the local crew taken on in the islands. 1 ship out of 5, the hold filled with cloves. The cargo sold in Spain would eventually turn a profit. The arithmetic of the spice trade was ruthless enough to absorb even these losses and come out positive on paper. The Trinidad never made it back the Pacific way. She tried, was captured by the Portuguese in the Moluccas, and her crew spent years in captivity before the survivors, a small number of them, eventually found their way home by other means. She had no triumphant return, no Santiago Cathedral reception. She simply vanished into the machinery of Portuguese imperial enforcement and did not come out as a ship. The Victoria had made it. 1 vessel, a skeleton crew, and a route that no one had ever sailed before, completed in the wrong direction for safety and the right direction for history. When the Victoria limped into Sanlúcar de Barrameda with 18 survivors and a hold full of cloves, the immediate reaction was wonder. But the more lasting reaction, the one that unfolded over the following months and years in the courts of Spain, in the workshops of cartographers, in the offices of merchants trying to understand what the spice trade now meant, was something more complicated than wonder. It was a fundamental recalculation of almost everything Europeans thought they knew about the size of the world they lived on. The most immediate correction was to scale. European geographical thinking before the voyage had consistently underestimated how much of the Earth was covered by water, and more specifically, how vast the Pacific Ocean actually was. The maps that existed when Magellan left Spain showed the distance between South America and Asia as something navigable in weeks, an inconvenient gap between known worlds, not an obstacle that could kill you through sheer emptiness. The Victoria's crossing had taken roughly 3.5 months across open water, with almost nothing to show for most of it. No significant islands, no reliable resupply points, just water, in every direction, for longer than any sailor had been asked to endure before. This was not what anyone had predicted, and it could not be argued away. The Pacific was not a sea. It was an ocean of a magnitude that older maps had simply failed to imagine, and every cartographer working after 1522 had to account for that reality, whether they wanted to or not. What followed was a rapid expansion of European maps, but not just in the sense of filling in blanks. The proportions had to change. If the Pacific was this large, then the Earth itself had to be understood differently. Its surface was mostly ocean, the land masses that Europeans had centered their worldview around were islands in a much larger watery context, and the distances between everything were greater than the inherited classical estimates had suggested. Ptolemy's geography, which had been the foundation for European cartographic thinking for centuries, had put the circumference of the Earth at a figure that made Columbus's westward gamble seem logical. The voyage didn't disprove the spherical Earth. That idea was already old and already accepted by educated Europeans, but it demonstrated, through the brute fact of how long the journey actually took, that the sphere was larger and less hospitable to simple navigation than the inherited numbers had implied. Some older assumptions were confirmed. The Earth was indeed round, the seas were indeed connected. A ship that kept going west would eventually come back from the east. But the specific scale of those ideas had been wrong in ways that mattered enormously for anyone planning to actually sail on them. The voyage also forced a rethinking of the relationship between continents and oceans. Before Magellan's fleet, the working assumption was that the known land masses, Europe, Africa, Asia, and the newly encountered Americas, were separated by manageable bodies of water. The expedition revealed that the Americas were not a narrow obstruction between Europe and Asia, but a continent in their own right, flanked by an Atlantic on one side and a Pacific of almost incomprehensible width on the other. The Strait of Magellan, for all the suffering it had cost, was genuinely valuable knowledge. It was a passage, however brutal, and it confirmed that South America had a southern end, that you could in theory get through to the Pacific without crossing the land itself. Cartographers incorporated the strait into their maps almost immediately. The shape of South America became more accurate, more recognizable to modern eyes, within years of the voyage's return. Then there was the puzzle that the crew themselves discovered, and it took a moment for its significance to register. The Victoria's logbook recorded the date of arrival in Spain as September 6th. The calendar kept by people remaining in Spain recorded that same day as September 6th, but the crew of the Victoria had maintained a daily log throughout the voyage, recording each sunrise and sunset, and by their count they had arrived one day earlier than Spain said it was. They had lost a day. They had travelled west continuously, chasing the sun in its apparent path around the Earth, and by doing so they had experienced slightly shorter days over the cumulative length of the voyage, not enough to notice on any single day, but enough to add up to a full day over the course of a trip around the entire planet. They had sailed around the world and arrived home thinking it was September 5th, when it was actually September 6th. One revolution of the Earth travelled in the direction of the Earth's rotation, and time itself had slipped. This was not simply a curiosity. It was a practical problem with real implications for navigation, for the calculation of dates on long voyages, and for the philosophical question of what time actually is when it depends on where you're standing and which direction you're moving. The lost day became a genuine puzzle for scholars and navigators in the years following, and it laid some of the intellectual groundwork for thinking seriously about the relationship between longitude, time, and position. Questions that would not be fully resolved until the invention of reliable marine chronometers centuries later, but which the Victoria's voyage had thrown into sharp relief for the first time. The rulers who received the expedition's findings absorbed them with varying degrees of speed and sophistication. Charles I of Spain understood quickly enough that the voyage had altered the terms of negotiation with Portugal over the division of the world established by the Treaty of Tordesillas. If you could now sail west to the Spice Islands and confirm their location, the question of which empire those islands belonged to under a treaty that had divided an incompletely understood world became considerably more complicated. The Moluccas ended up being sold to Portugal by Spain in 1529, a transaction that reflected the practical realities of naval power rather than the theoretical implications of the voyage. but the circumnavigation had made it clear that the old treaty was describing a world that no longer quite matched reality. What Magellan's expedition ultimately proved was not one clean, simple thing. It proved multiple things simultaneously, and they didn't all point in the same direction. It confirmed that the Earth could be circumnavigated, that the oceans were connected, that a ship could in principle go around the world and come back. It overturned the assumed scale of that world, revealing it as larger, more water-covered, and less forgiving than earlier geographers had imagined. It complicated old agreements and old ideas about where empires ended and others began. And it introduced, almost as an afterthought, a puzzle about time that pointed toward questions no one in 1522 had the tools to fully answer. The Victoria had come back with 18 men, a hold full of spices, and a collection of facts about the planet that would take the rest of the century to fully absorb. All of that recalculation, the new maps, the corrected scales, the lost day, the renegotiated treaties, raises a question that seems simple on the surface but gets thornier the longer you sit with it. Who exactly deserves the credit for what happened? The name that history attached to the voyage almost immediately was Magellan's. The Strait bears his name. The expedition is routinely called Magellan's circumnavigation in textbooks, encyclopedias, and casual conversation. There are statues, schools, and a set of galaxies named after him. His portrait appears on the commemorative coins. For most of the world, when the story of the first circumnavigation gets told, it is fundamentally his story, the Portuguese navigator who conceived the impossible voyage, convinced Spain to fund it, and drove it forward through sheer unyielding will. Ferdinand Magellan died in the Philippines in April 1521, roughly halfway through the expedition in terms of time, and considerably more than halfway through in terms of the unknown. He never saw the Spice Islands he had set out to reach. He never crossed the Indian Ocean on the homeward leg. He never saw Spain again. By any strict geographical definition, he did not circumnavigate the globe. The man who brought the Victoria home, the man who actually completed the circuit, was Juan Sebastián Elcano, a Basque navigator who had been among the mutineers in Patagonia, and who therefore spent part of the voyage under a sentence of conditional pardon. He is the one who sailed the final arc. He is the one who guided 18 starving men across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, up the Atlantic, and back to San Lucar de Barrameda. By the most literal accounting, Elcano is the first person to captain a vessel around the entire world. Spain knew this. Charles V granted Elcano a coat of arms that included a globe and the Latin motto Primus circumdedisti me. You were the first to circumnavigate me. It was an explicit, official acknowledgement that Elcano had done something no one had done before. In Spain, and particularly in the Basque country, his legacy has been vigorously defended for centuries. There are statues in his hometown of Guetaria. His face appeared on Spanish currency. Historians in Spain have periodically fought rearguard actions against what they see as the Anglo and general European tendency to erase Elcano in favour of Magellan, and their frustration is not without foundation. So why does Magellan dominate the story anyway? Part of the answer is practical and unglamorous. Magellan's vision initiated the voyage, and first causes tend to attract narrative gravity. He was the one who had sailed these waters before, who had been to the Spice Islands from the east, who believed with enough conviction that a western passage existed to stake his life and his reputation on it. Without his obsession, there is no expedition. Without his negotiation in the Spanish court, there are no ships. Without his determination through the Atlantic, through Patagonia, through the Strait, and across the Pacific, the fleet never reaches the point where Elcano's leadership could matter. There is a version of the argument that says Magellan did the harder half, the completely unknown half, and that Elcano, however skillfully, was navigating waters that, while dangerous, were at least waters where European ships had already sailed. The Indian Ocean was not new. The route home from the Moluccas was not new. Magellan's Pacific was. But there is also something less flattering driving the imbalance, and it has to do with who wrote the story down. Antonio Pigafetta was an Italian scholar and adventurer who joined the expedition as a volunteer observer and kept a meticulous journal throughout. He is our single most detailed first-hand account of the voyage, and his affection for Magellan is unmistakable on almost every page. Pigafetta portrayed Magellan as a leader of exceptional courage and vision, a man who outmaneuvered mutineers, inspired desperate men through impossible conditions, and met his death heroically at Mactan rather than retreating. His account shaped how the voyage was remembered in the courts and intellectual circles of Europe, because he was the one who wrote it down engagingly enough for people to actually read it. Elcano's own account, submitted to the Spanish crown, was more functional, a navigator's report rather than a narrative, and it simply never achieved the same cultural reach. Narrative shaped reputation, and reputation hardened into legacy. Pigafetta's Magellan became the Magellan that Europe remembered, and by the time historians began seriously interrogating the gap between Pigafetta's portrait and the messier reality, the name was already carved into maps, into history books, into the common understanding of what the voyage was. The question of national narrative complicates things further. Portugal never claimed Magellan warmly. He had defected to Spain, sailed under a foreign flag, and died before achieving anything they wanted credit for. Spain claimed the expedition as Spanish, which meant the crown and Elcano featured prominently in Spanish accounts. But Spain's global reputation in the centuries after the voyage was complicated by the violence and exploitation that colonialism brought, and the expedition itself was not without its own share of that. The people of the Philippines, the Moluccas, and Guam experienced the arrival of European ships, not as a moment of wonder but as the beginning of something much longer and much darker. Magellan's alliance with Raja Humabon and the attack on Lapu-Lapu's forces at Mactan was not simply an explorer getting involved in local politics. It was a preview of the methods European powers would use across the Pacific and Southeast Asia for the next several centuries. Which brings you to the most honest and perhaps most uncomfortable framing of the voyage's legacy. It was simultaneously a triumph of human endurance and navigational ambition, a genuine expansion of knowledge about the planet, a tragedy in which the majority of the men who set out never returned, and the opening move in a long process of imperial expansion that caused enormous harm to the peoples on the other side of those newly mapped oceans. These are not competing interpretations that you have to choose between. They are all true at the same time, and any account that picks only one of them is telling a partial story. Magellan deserves credit. Elcano deserves credit. The 18 survivors who dragged themselves back to Spain deserve credit. So do the pilots, the gunners, the translators, and even Pigafetta, who made sure that something of what happened was written down at all. And the people who encountered these ships and experienced what came after deserve to be part of the story too, not as backdrop, but as participants in an event that changed their world just as dramatically as it changed Europe's understanding of the one they all shared. There is an image that keeps returning when you try to hold this entire story in your mind at once. 5 ships leaving the harbour at Sanlúcar de Barrameda in the late summer of 1519, loaded with trade goods, weapons, anxious men, and a conviction, held by one man more fiercely than anyone else, that the world connected on the other side. That the edge was not an edge, that the blank space on the map was not emptiness but possibility. Medieval cartographers had drawn monsters at the margins, where knowledge ran out. Imagination filled in, and the imagination of the time defaulted to terror. Sea creatures large enough to swallow vessels whole, currents that drained into an abyss beneath the world, a horizon that once crossed could not be uncrossed. These were not simply superstitions held by the ignorant. They reflected something real, which was that the ocean beyond a certain point was genuinely unknown, and the unknown has always pressed on the human mind with a weight that feels a great deal like dread. Magellan sailed into that dread and kept going. The cost of doing so was staggering. 270 men set out. 18 returned. 5 ships became one. 4 captains were executed, died in battle, or deserted. The fleet spent months anchored off a frozen coastline, while its crew shivered and its officers plotted against each other. It crossed an ocean so much larger than anyone had guessed that men went blind from starvation and chewed the leather from the rigging to keep themselves alive. It navigated a labyrinthine channel at the foot of the Americas, through weeks of wind and freezing rain, probing every inlet for a passage that might not have existed. And the man who conceived all of this, who drove it forward through sheer will and ferocious refusal to turn back, died on a beach in the Philippines before seeing any of it resolved. What Magellan provided was the vision, the conviction, and the brutal forward momentum through every obstacle the voyage placed in front of him. What Elcano provided was something different, but equally necessary: the judgment to understand what remained possible when the situation had collapsed to almost nothing, and the seamanship to bring the Victoria home across oceans that even experienced navigators had every reason to fear. These were not competing contributions. They were sequential ones, and the voyage required both. Without Magellan's obsession, the expedition never leaves the harbour. Without Elcano's pragmatism and endurance, it never closes the circle. The first circumnavigation of the earth was, in the end, a relay across the whole of it. And what it changed was not simply geography. The maps were redrawn. Yes, the Pacific finally given something approximating its true scale. The globe's proportions corrected in ways that made every prior map look like a rough sketch. The Treaty of Tordesillas, which had divided the world between Spain and Portugal along a single line of longitude, suddenly looked inadequate, because now you had to account for what happened when you went all the way around. Empires adjusted their calculations. Trade routes were reconsidered. The Spice Islands, which had been an eastern destination for the Portuguese, were revealed to be reachable from the west, which meant that the contest over who owned access to them had just become substantially more complicated. But the change that matters most is harder to plot on any map. It is the change in how people imagined the planet they lived on. Before 1522, the world was large in an abstract sense, but it still had edges, places where the known stopped and something else began. After the Victoria limped back into port with 18 hollow-eyed men aboard, that was no longer quite true. The world had a shape now. It was a sphere, not as a theoretical assertion made by ancient philosophers, but as a demonstrated, navigated, lived-in fact. You could leave a port, sail in one direction, keep going, and eventually arrive back where you started. The earth was not infinite. It was not bottomless. It was not full of monsters at the margin. It was, and this is both the simplest and the most staggering conclusion of the entire enterprise, round, finite, and crossable. That realization did not arrive gently or without cost. The circumnavigation was the first chapter in a much longer story of European contact with the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and that longer story contains enormous suffering alongside its genuine moments of encounter and wonder. The same knowledge that expanded the European imagination was used to project European power, and the people on the other side of those maps paid for that projection across the centuries that followed. But the knowledge itself, the sheer vertiginous fact of the world's true size and shape, belonged to everyone. It was not a European discovery in the sense that it was not something Europe invented. It was a discovery about a planet that had always been that size, always been that shape, always been that traversable. What changed was simply that human beings now knew it, had proven it with their bodies and their ships and their suffering, and could never unknow it again. The greatest thing Magellan and Elcano found was not the Spice Islands. It was not a new sea route or a strategic advantage for the Spanish crown. It was the actual scale of the world, vast beyond imagination, and yet, against all expectation, navigable. They went off the edge of every known map, and the world came back larger,